Thank you very much. I'm going to introduce all of our panelists, all two of our panelists, because we had a late cancellation. Julian Randall is sick; he couldn't make it. Not just because it's prepared, but also because I think his book is spectacular and everybody should still read it. I want to introduce him anyway, so I'll start with Julian Randall, a living queer black poet from Chicago. Julian received fellowships from Cave Canem, Condemundo, Callaloo, and The Watering Hole. He's the recipient of the Pushcart Prize, winner of the 2019 Betty Berzon Emerging Writers Award from the Publishing Triangle, and his work has been published in the New York Times Magazine, Plowshares, Poetry, anthologized in Black Boy Joy, Wild Tongues Can't Be Tamed, and Furious Flower. His essays have appeared in The Atlantic, Vibe Magazine, Los Angeles Review of Books, and other venues, and he holds an MFA in poetry from the University of Mississippi. Now to the writers who are here. To my immediate right, Priyanka Mattoo is the author of the memoir Bird Milk and Mosquito Bones, NOP, from June of this year. She was formerly an agent at UTA and WME, as well as Jack Black's partner at the production company Electric Dynamite, which I think is just the coolest thing. Meeting famous people. Priyanka co-founded Irios, the woman-led podcast network, and co-hosted its critically acclaimed beauty wellness podcast, Foxy Browns. Her writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Vulture, and The Hairpin, and her film work has appeared in festivals from Sundance to Cannes. She was raised in India, England, and Saudi Arabia before moving to the US in high school and holds degrees in Italian and law from the University of Michigan. And one small thing I found on her website, she also had a piece in Best American Food Writing whose title is fantastic, How to Extract a Mother's Rogan Josh Recipe Over Zoom. Just maybe, if you don't want to read that article after you read that title, I don't know you. And then to my far right, Joseph Earl Thomas. He's the author of Sink, a memoir, 2022, from Grand Central Publishing. It was longlisted for the Penn Gene Stein Book Award, and his brand new novel, which, am I right, is just published this month or last month? June. Oh, in June, is God Bless You, Otis Spunkmeyer, from Grand Central again. And, his forthcoming story collection, coming in 2025, is called Leviathan Beach. His writing has appeared has been published in the Kenyon Review, the Paris Review, Virginia Quarterly Review, Dilettante Army, and the New York Times Book Review. And he has been honored with the 2020 Chautauqua Janus Prize and fellowships from Kimbaleo, Vona, Tin House, and Breadloaf. He's a graduate of the University of Notre Dame's MFA program in prose and got a PhD in English from the University of Pennsylvania, and is a member of the writing faculty at Sarah Lawrence College. So if we could give a quick round of applause for our authors. And I thought we might start off, I think all of these panels conversations are fantastic, but you probably ought to know what you're getting into when you start. So I asked both of them to prepare a short reading of their work, and then we'll jump into some questions, and there'll be time at the end for some questions from the audience. So I think we didn't discuss who goes first, but Priyanka seems to be resigned to it. So Priyanka, Mattoo.
To introduce the book, I was born in Kashmir. Can you not hear? Is it not on? Hello? Hello? Is that better? Okay, there we go. Oh, I love that. To introduce the book, I was born in Kashmir, which is a disputed territory between India and Pakistan. It's in the foothills of the Himalayas. It's stunningly gorgeous. We built a house there that was ultimately in the late 80s burned down by militants. And our whole community fled, and we were never able to return. So the story is really about, the story of my life is a story of sort of constant movement and the search for home. And so there are a lot of sad things in this book, but I hope a lot of heart and humor. And today I didn't feel like reading anything sad, and I woke up missing my brother, my baby brother, so I'm going to read you a little bit about him and when I met him. This is from a chapter called Sibling Revelry. My baby brother is 39 years old, FYI. Just he lives in London. In the photos of my baby brother's homecoming, first I lurk in the background, 5.5 years old, and seething with rage. This isn't because of the competition. It's because I'm irate that my parents promised me a baby and now they won't give him to me. I then reach for him again and again. Finally, they sit behind me, encircling my body, supporting his neck. It dawns on me in this array of photos that I'll have to share him. By the time Puneet was born, I was a fully formed, fully bored person who wanted a baby in the house. But my campaign for a younger sibling had begun when I was around 3, when my nursery school peers in England started bringing by baby sisters and brothers. I was otherwise occupied by my books and my blossoming friendships with my teachers. I didn't have a lot of friends. But a baby seemed like the best sort of companion, a pet, an acolyte, and an outlet for my desire to be in charge, all in one. My mother claims not to remember the details of this, but my recollection is that the baby was my idea, that my parents had him for me. Sorry. It's a hot mic. And that when he was born, I gratefully took him off their hands, keeping him company, packing his lunch, and making his afternoon snack until I went to college. Every morning on waking up, I'd go give Puneet a cuddle. When he was 9 months old, we left England for Saudi Arabia, and my caretaking moved with us. Every afternoon, I came home and prepared us a meal, as my mother had done for me. And Puneet was so easy to love. He was born with a serene smile on his face, game for whatever I wanted to play. He never gave us a day of trouble. As Dad sometimes says, he raised himself, and he must have been a vacation to raise after me, the questioner. I was a dissatisfied child, always ready for the next thing, not quite happy with how classes were being taught or how tags felt in my clothes. I was so sensitive to the world. Everything was too bright or loud or slow or just wrong somehow. But Puneet ate anything, did anything the family asked him to do, with not so much as a peep of complaint, and always, always his peaceful smile. I had all these, I guess we call them leadership qualities now, and no boardroom to use them in. So I did everything for that sweet boy. The night before his first day of kindergarten, I couldn't sleep. A die-hard school enthusiast, now entering 5th grade, I had talked it up like the moon landing. I vibrated with the anticipation of walking him to the playground, showing him where to line up his backpack, helping work the water fountains. His first day would be flawless, I would make certain. I was too excited to sleep, so I waited all night, wiggling in my bed until I couldn't any longer. I tiptoed into his room and shook the little guy awake. "Wakey, wakey," I whispered. He groaned, stumbled to the bathroom, and swayed, eyes closed, as I brushed his teeth, scrubbed his face, combed his hair, and then my own. His voice croaked, "Didi, I don't know if I can do this every day." "The more you do it, the more you get used to it, I promise," I said. I got him back into his bedroom, into the clothes I had picked out, and put on his backpack, after which he crawled back into bed, fully dressed. I heard my mother at his door and turned around, beaming. I was ready, as usual, for her to commend what a good Didi, big sister, I had been. But wait, she was bleary-eyed, in her nightgown. "It's 4 a.m, she said. Everyone back to bed. Other than that blip, my parents marveled at my caretaking. In hindsight, even cultivated it, and I guzzled up their praise like a mouse in a puddle of syrup. I had taken over so much of Puneet's daily schedule that my role echoed a small parent's. In making sure he felt happy and taken care of, I was happy. We polished up that morning routine eventually and created new ones after school. I made him ramen or toaster pizza after we got home. I packed his lunches. And I remember a day in middle school when I panicked, realizing I had given him my turkey sandwich and I had his peanut butter one, no jelly. I raced across to the elementary school to switch out the lunches and made it there before he could be disappointed. For my dedicated service, he repaid me in adoration. I can always tell when Mom makes the lunch, he whispered to me once. It doesn't taste as good. For this, I would have made his lunch for the rest of his life.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I guess I'll say a little bit for context. And one of the ways that I've thought about this book has been to consider what living a life as a child might be without the guarantee of, aspirational, like, becoming a tax-paying adult, which I think is what happens a lot of times in coming-of-age narratives more broadly, and to think about what it means to become a person if there's very clear barriers to both social structural resources, i.e. like education, especially in the public sector, and or individual people. I think of this trope presenting itself, for example, as the Juan character from Moonlight, or a social worker or a teacher who in particular manages to like save your life or something. And I'll just read a little bit from the beginning and maybe one other section. Of all the protagonists in this story, both real and imagined, just Joey, the boy, owned an easy-bake oven. Owned it the way his grandfather, Pop-Pop, owned sound, like the sound of Joey's name sliding out of smoke-black lips. Joy, he always said, Joy, come here. Joey was timid, to put it nicely, and the oven was purchased with the help of Capital One for his little sister, Mika, anyway. Joey had convinced Mika that she wanted one, and therefore, at 7, he received a gift that, through Pop-Pop's eyes, sat scandalous in the lap of his little black man in training. But Joey used it to make cheesecake, red velvet cupcakes, blackened salmon, fried chicken, and Chilean sea bass with dirty rice. The oven itself was tiny and pink, sitting on a fold-out dinner tray, flimsy and flower patterned, purchased from the Dollar General just 3 blocks away. And beneath the oven, Joey kept a black notebook. No one ever checked under there. Knowing he would make mistakes, he wrote only in pencil and yet always struggled to come back and revise. And he drew. He drew stories of lonely sea monsters, moving pictures with tiny speech bubbles sprouting from their mouths like in comic books. Some of them had rotten teeth and smelled bad. They were very long and green, like giant snakes, and constantly angry. One such creature had a hood like a cobra because Joey had watched Steve Irwin play with one on The Crocodile Hunter and thought it would make a good pet. Watching the emotive white man in khaki from Australia made Joey wonder about different kinds of danger and how some forms of fear were cool and quick and entertaining and others were not. He imagined himself far away like his sea creatures. Joey's sea creatures would say things like, "Grr, I'm gonna eat you," to humans rocking through waves on wooden boats. Then, without warning, the creatures would smash the poor human's vessel into pieces. On the page, wood splintered in brown oil pastel shards through a deep blue sea of unknowing. The sailors aboard all drowned or woke up sopping wet on tiny islands with just a single palm tree. Joey had, of course, questions about why, if granted only one tree, it should always be a species without fruit. But this was ultimately fine, as artistically it felt good. Stranded, the survivors would ask a scuttling crab, why? Why did this happen? Scuttle was among Joey's favorite words. A survivor might, post-scuttling around, stand there in a yellow raincoat, weeping under acidic droplets falling from an ever-darkening sky, shaded by Joey's godlike thumbs and the side of a sharp pencil. Starving, the survivor would watch sea creatures gorge themselves on the ocean's bounty, a contradiction to the brackish water Joey had seen in the Schuylkill River, if ever there was one. A sea monster would drag an orca from the water, sometimes a baby, and slam its body brain first in the rocky shore over and over again. The blood was gratuitous, thick and red marker to glisten wet, making the page feel so soggy and smell so good till it dried up and warped in brittle position. Upon seeing the bloody orca smashed into those rocks, a survivor might ask a sea creature why he did it. Why slam them around like that? Were they not dead enough already? In the front of this same black book, Joey wrote names in dark red lines. tracing over them several times each, first, middle, and last, no initials. He'd work himself into a fury, talking to these names in his own head, overly simple dialogues, strange and unnecessary questions with no real answers, like those posed to a child in real life. Let's say, why you hold your wrist like that? Joey wanted these names, these people, to die. Or, he thought, if people are going to die inevitably, young or old, or in pain or otherwise, these people should jump the line. Adults would find this cruel, but not as cruel as Joey found them. And he could never do the killing himself because, well, he was a coward, which never curtailed his devotion to such death in theory. He did not consider himself a supervillain. He would toe a careful line, somewhere between the kind of man that his mother, Keisha, might be afraid of and the kind that could protect her, past 7, if he ever might be something more than both at the same time. I'll stop right there.
Well, I'm doing less talking than you
Okay.
are. That's fantastic. Thank you so much. I want to start with giving just a quick origin story of your books. How did the idea germinate? How did it come to fruition? What was the journey of the book?
Well, I wasn't a writer. I was a reader, a big reader. I always read like a crazy person, but I didn't know that writing could be a life for me. You know, I came up in an immigrant family that had been displaced, and so we sought out stability above all else. So I was strongly encouraged to pursue a professional career, and I did that. You know, I was pre-med, and then I went to law school, and I did what I thought I was supposed to do, but none of it felt right. You know, I definitely ended up. I did sort of like creative adjacent jobs. I was a Hollywood agent for a while. I produced. But for all these years, I read, and I loved personal essay, and I loved memoir, and I loved reading about my homeland, Kashmir, but I was reading over and over again the headlines of things that had happened to us, and I was always sort of my people were always sort of the object of pity or tragedy, or talked about in these kind of like moaning, sad ways, and I remember waking up and just thinking, I wish that someone would write about who we are and who we were and what we celebrate and all these family stories that have been passed down for generations. I wish that someone would do that. And then I realized that I would have to. And so I wrote an op-ed for the Times. That was an essay. That was my first real essay about Kashmir. And that became the first chapter of this book. And that, yeah, it just poured out of me. There was no other, that was just kind of it. It just sort of, everything I had held on to for so long, I had run away from my real life into the Hollywood bubble where like none of these things existed, and the news did not exist, the geopolitical situation did not exist. I did not have to explain or talk about my homeland ever for many, many years, but it catches up with you. It caught up with me, and I wrote the book, and yeah, I feel like I'm where I'm supposed to be.
That's great.
Yeah, this is so similar but different in some ways. I didn't come to writing immediately. I always felt kind of alienated by the sense, or always from the time that I began writing, with the sense that it felt like everyone was born that way, or was like 4th or 5th generation college graduates, and that the entire literary establishment was run by people who went to Yale as undergrads or something like that. So it felt really alienating for me, but I initially, I did a lot of other things before I came to writing. I joined the military when I was 17. I deployed to Iraq when I was 19, and just worked a bunch of other jobs in between. And part of that was an attempt to gain stability in my life. And when I did start to get some stability, the thing I sought out initially was more stability. So I ended up being also pre-med, and going to right, exactly. But during the whole time I was doing that, I would occasionally meet people who, because I was taking like FM literature course, dice work literature, creative writing, etc., on the side, as I would have called it then. And I eventually met a professor who was like, if you wanted to take this seriously, they'll pay you to go to school instead of you paying them, which I thought was bullshit. I was like, Aisha, you're lying. There's no such thing as you go get an MFA and people will give you money to do that, or a PhD. And at the time, I was also in graduate school for medicine. I was going to be a physician assistant. I was at Drexel, which was costing a lot of money, et cetera, et cetera. And I was like, okay, sure, I'll try this other thing. I left. And I applied to MFA programs. I did an MA first, then an MFA at Notre Dame, and then my PhD at UPenn, and I kind of never looked back in that sense. And then the specifics of coming to the book were, in some ways, kind of opposite from that description, which was I felt like haunted by the specter of a certain kind of formal progress that no one I knew could claim for themselves. I.e., the people in my life and the people who I loved and the people who loved me were primarily people who were in and out of prison, not college, who I do not come from a people who have anything like leisure time, and therefore reading and writing were kind of put to the side. And so I wanted to think pedagogically about how I could take that seriously and build a life not just for myself, but for other people with whom I might share some companionship with. And I mean, this specter is just as real in a kind of popular program like The Cosbys or something, right? Like that was the kind of major export that I was shown and that I was expected to aspire to, even though no one I knew had, that level of respectability politics in them. It's kind of laughable knowing what we know now, of course, the level of dishonesty that I felt like I had to engage. So I wanted to think about what coming of age looked like and what living looked like if you took some of those other spaces seriously and attempted to negotiate some of the things that we think of as disgusting or horrible or only deserving of punishment as being really important aspects of a social world and a life that wasn't just about shame or anything, or aspiring to proper, middle-class syntax and diction or something like that. And I think that that's a broader part of my project altogether, but that was the main focus of this book.
It's great. It's not lost on me that both of you in pre-med and have this kind of feeling that you're that urge to take care of people, I think, is an urge a writer has too in some ways, or has to, because they have to pay attention to who they're writing to. I do also want to just stop and talk a little bit about the act of memoir in general, the kind of personalness of it, the way that it functions. Both of you, I think, have really interesting ways of dealing with that, right? Third person for sync, and this kind of temporal disorder in bird milk and mosquito bones. What brought you to those decisions when most memoirs are pretty traditionally I was born and then yesterday, or and it's always I, right? What brought you to those decisions to change that formula, and how do you feel it has kind of impacted the book and your life when you're recounting it?
Big question.
Sorry.
No.
I should have divided it
I'm
up.
ready. I'm just wondering which door to go in. I sometimes feel, oh God, I wish I had gone to school and gotten an MFA. I would have been around my people instead of lawyers, that was weird. Agents. It was awful. It was all awful. Anyway, I'm here now. But I'm also grateful that I didn't have any kind of formal training, I just had to build a book. I knew I wanted to build a book of my family stories. I wanted to write a love letter to my family and get these stories down. So I got to build a book from scratch. So I wrote down the stories that had stuck with me, that I felt had shaped me and shaped my family. I just wrote down the facts. I was like, here's what happened. And I had a timeline of, say, 20 stories. But then once I dove in and I started to mine the why they were so important to me, how I think they shaped me and my family, I realized it was so much about who I am today. And that's what I sort of am drawn to in the personal essay form, is that you do get to time travel. This is not a biography. It's not laying out from A to Z, how my life was. It's memoir for a reason. So it's very much about my memories and how they shape who I am today, who my mother is today, who we are as a family, who we are as a community. So I did try putting it in chronological order, and it was boring and terrible. It didn't make any sense. It was just all over the place. So I really ended up putting it in sort of terms of emotional growth. So you'll see that the spine of the book is really me growing as a human who then built my own family and my search for home. But then my emotional growth is triggered by events that are sort of scattered in the past. So that's why the events are all over the place, because that's also how we grow. Next week you might have a realization about something that happened when you were 6, and that informs, what next week is. And the week after you might remember something, oh my God, this crazy thing happened when I was 24. How did I never make the connection before? So that is how the book shaped out of order, just as our own stilted, weird human growth does.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely feel you on the chronology problem as well. Sometimes it's hard for me to read something that is in strict chronological order at all. Just maybe I don't have the attention span for it in a little bit. It's funny, Dustin, when you say the kind of starting with I was born, that the first thing that comes to mind for me is Frederick Douglass. Descriptions of understanding basically power and entry into what will later be called the Bloodstained Gate. Says a lot about my psyche or something like that. I think that, for me, there's a thing that gets talked about with regards to memoir that I never understood, which is that it can potentially be solipsistic or navel-gazing. And this also has to do for me with the history and origins of the novel in general, which we still use. 19th century European novel form is the standard that we still use to write anything. And taking those two things in mind, I thought, well, if I'm interested in what happens or how you build a life when you don't come into the world being taught anything as standard, one of the ways that I wanted to do that was explore what that kind of confinement looks like. And so I built stories primarily around interviews with people that I loved or knew or who remembered me. And so rather than building the story primarily with things that I remembered, it was more I would be interviewing my mother, grandmother, grandfather, etc. And I would gather things that they said repeatedly, and then I would set rules for myself and say, okay, I'm only going to talk about things that happen over and over again, and that there seems to be a consensus about, which is how it gets to the fact of why do you have all these animals or pets or whatever? Because every single person I talked to was you remember how weird you were, with these snakes, and they were breeding them or whatever? And so then for me, then that has to be a part of the narrative. Similarly, with all of the kind of growing into and understanding not just sexuality, but sexual experience at a very early age. I think there's a distinction that we don't always make with those things. The women in my family in particular, a lot of the conversations I would have with them had to do with their interest in my sexuality as a very young person. And to me, what I did was kind of put those things together and decide how I was going to shape a book that felt more outside of the individual essayistic kind of explanatory mode that I think sometimes happens, and make it more novelistic while playing with both of those conventions. On one end, our understanding and feeling of safety around novel convention, and on the other, the expectation that we go into a certain kind of safe explanation of our own experience rather than trying to detail it.
Yeah, well, and that brings up, I think, an interesting thing about where your own truth versus where the truth of you as the object rather than the subject comes in, right? Because I think I don't think I knew this from the text, but hearing you say you interviewed a lot of the people in your family, Priyanka, I know in your book you actually talk about how you talked to your mom several times about things, and your brother a few times, and they always seem to remember things very differently.
Very differently.
So that must have been kind of an experience too, to have that that sense of somebody else who is older than you in some cases know something about you that you had misremembered, or that you remember correctly and they misremember. What was negotiating that like?
Well, I come from a very long oral storytelling tradition. So these are family stories that my family has told me over and over and over and over again 1,000 times. I didn't have to go looking for them. They're just in my body. But then I started to wonder, are my memories real, or are they stories I was told? Are your memories real? Because we remember them differently. And then ultimately what it came down to was like the facts almost don't matter, because we have just become who we are through what we have carried forward from how we remember things. That's just what forms us. So I tried to, as often as I could, present a story as I experienced it. And then if there's a distinct contrast from another family member, I also present that. And I go, make what you will, because my mother is now formed by that seminal story in a much different way than I was, which I think is really interesting. The memoir is, I guess unusually so. I wrote a memoir in which the trauma did not come from inside the house. I wrote a memoir about a family that has a glue that holds us together. Everything outside was, crappy many times. But we were held together by these stories and this love for each other. And so it was really important to me to really investigate that and get into sort of the fallibility of our memories, but how important they can be. Because it could have been a textbook, and I think I had a fear when I started writing about Kashmir that people would want me to write some sort of political treatise, which I was not interested in, and ended up writing, I think, just like what I think is a group project from like a bunch of voices. I hope that comes across, and it turned out the way that I wanted to.
Yeah, I think I don't really have any trust of my own memory at all, especially not now. I feel like, and a lot of people say this at some point, if you ever have kids, the kind of sleep that you lose in general. And I would have like auditory hallucinations when my kids were really little, as if like I could hear something happening in the other room, and I would just be up. And then they would even not be at my house, and I would still have it. And I think that contributes to memory. Like, is that an experience that I'm remembering from before? And like, how does one even talk about that or something? Yeah. But I will say that I think the things that I do remember most are kind of adhered through humor for me. And I think that's also true with a lot of family members. And so a lot of the things that we would joke about often get repeated, or often end up as part of stories, even in the middle of something that could otherwise be like, what we would call like difficult material or something like that. And for me, that's my favorite kind of moment, when there is a kind of counterbalance between something harsh and something deeply hilarious, especially if they're in the same sentence or you embed a kind of shift in clauses or whatever. That happens that way. But mostly, I'm kind of okay with somebody being like, you are wrong, you remember that wrong. I think it's really interesting. Yeah. And sometimes it can be fun to write about. So there's a particular moment in the book that's a hospital stay I had in 1996. It was a big blizzard in Philadelphia. I was a kid playing outside. I got pneumonia. That I remember it really well because I'm like, and it was easy to mark that time. I'm like, it's verifiable. There was a blizzard this year. This is the first time I was in the hospital. And then, people in my family, they were beefing about like who came to the hospital to see me first or something. Like everybody has like competitive care Olympics. Like I was a better caretaker. No, I was a better caretaker, in an otherwise like really difficult situation where you can't care for anyone anyway, right? Yeah. But that's what people cared about, and so I'm interested in that. And what turns up in the book is like there's just two versions of it that happen from those two different perspectives.
Yeah, and I was going to say in that moment too, because it's a pretty long segment in what is otherwise some short moments around it. There is also almost a haziness around. Like it wasn't the next day something happened; it was later something happened. And so like it felt like really authentically. You were in the hospital and you were really sick, and there's a legitimate reason why I can't denote every moment of time. It really felt like you were floating through that time, in a way. So that's really interesting too. I also want to, while I still have the time before the audience starts to jump in, was really interested in pop culture in the texts. It's something it's always going to influence. And if you got a chance to read Julian's book as well, he grapples with it, maybe even more than these two books do, that the influence of pop culture, how pop culture has defined people's lives in the way that functions, or how we choose pop culture that will help define us. So what's your relationship to pop culture in general? I know in Sync, it's video games, it's fantasy. role-playing, it's things like that. For Bird Milk and Mosquito Bones, it feels more like music and film and things like that. But they have, it seems, different effects on you in the book and in the person. How do you experience it?
How do I experience pop culture?
Because I think it's very different between the two.
Yeah, I think, okay, where do I begin? I think for a long time, I've told you what my path was, although I did run away to Hollywood, which tells you something, right? So I was in the center of it for a while. I did work with a lot of incredibly famous people. I was around a lot of the stuff being made. And so I must have gone there for a reason, right? And the reason was I am an artist. I am not a lawyer. I am not meant to work with paperwork. I am not a detail-oriented person. And so all this time, I've been influenced by everything I read and everything I listen to. And it was so wonderful, honestly, the opportunity as I was writing this book to let a piece of music take me on a journey, to let an article I read take me on a journey, to let a window that I saw when I had a stomach ache, when I'm lying in London, take me on an online journey, it was like running free after sitting in my office job for, over a decade. And I did it for myself. I did it because it felt good. Yeah. And I just said, let's try this and see what happens. It's where I find my joy in seeking out creative people and creative things. So I think also tied into that is a lot of the stuff I've read and a lot of the stuff you'll read by Kashmiri authors is very much about us being victims of circumstance. And it was really important for me to say we laugh, we love things, we watch cartoons, we are funny, we are all these things. We are not just a headline. So that was really crucial to me too, to work in look, I'm a person just like you, which especially in India and anyone who knows about Kashmir here, we've sort of been held at arm's length as oh, poor Kashmiris. So I want to be no, we have joy in our lives and here's some evidence of it.
Yeah, there was that great chapter where you're interviewing one musician whose song you come upon kind of happenstance. That leads you to another musician, which leads you to this idea of what is it to dance in the face of tragedy or kind of an inherited tragedy for the younger generation of people who are experiencing it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm asked a lot when you really, I haven't, there's a lot of stuff happened to us. It was a very plot-heavy life. But I've been asked a lot, how do the fact that you use humor as a tool, I'm it's not a choice. We just don't know any other way to be. If you know anything about how I grew up, you would understand that there's nowhere, you mentioned this too, everything is passed down through humor, and our love language is very much trolling each other, and in the same way, the enjoyment of these small things takes away from the tragedy that we lost a homeland. That's a really big deal. I haven't gone back since I was 9. So yes, all these small joys are what make up our lives.
Fantastic.
Yeah, I guess one of the ways the pop culture stuff matters is that when your memory is really bad, pop culture does mark time in interesting ways. So, it's I remember not everything about, let's say, a room, for example, but I remember the first time that my grandfather, who was otherwise a very hard and difficult man, sat down to play Super Mario Brothers with me in the living room. And I remember teaching my little sister and brother how to play those video games as well because of that experience. And so those little things like that, I remember the first time I sat down to watch Dragon Ball Z or something like that with a friend, and these are certain kind of touchstones. I think it's also true that that kind of stuff helped me format the book because I also didn't want to do the strict chronology thing either. And it's sometimes shaped by the thing that you're watching or thinking about at the time, which lets you into another memory or set of experiences. It's weird, I was born in '88, and so one of the things that I think is interesting about the '90s, early 2000s, that we are still kind of catching up with as a culture is, people started to get internet in their homes, the way that we thought about social life changed, our relationship between indoors and outdoors started to change. For a lot of people in my generation, that was when these big kind of global products from Japan were coming into the United States in like a major way. This is when like the Pokemon generation or something like that we can think of, which also makes you look at American life and media in a different way that I think we weren't always already prepared to do. And I think it's really complicated, but because I didn't have books, that was a kind of comparative, like technology maybe for me, that helped me think about my relationships and life, et cetera.
And they function as metaphors sometimes. There's that great chapter on wanting to dress up as Dracula and having the fake teeth. But there was two different kinds of Dracula, right? There was the comical old style, and then there was the really terrifying, more contemporary. And eventually it becomes too much, like the dressing up ends up becoming a pivot point for people to pick on you and things like that. And so you move to mummies instead, which is this raising from the, you can't help but remember that all of these are death reincarnated almost, so they function really well as metaphors in there too. So I'm being told, we're going to open it up to everybody for questions, if you'd like to ask questions of the authors. I did such a fantastic job, nobody has questions.
These are memoirs. Are there other memories that you would put in another book? Are there memories that you go back and put in this book?
For everybody, are there more memories that they would like to, maybe make another book? Is there a part 2 coming? Right.
Yeah. I mean, I think of this book and the novel as kind of companion pieces that play with the question of, which I think is often a really weird question, is like, how did you make it kind of thing, that toy around with that and kind of make jokes about it. But yeah, probably like a couple thousand pages of other things that eventually didn't make it into this book or that book either, that I think become pieces to think about, and then eventually they might transform into something else.
And I'm writing a second book right now of essays. It sort of deals more with my present and future, but yeah, there's all kinds of, these were the 20 that I started with, but there are going to be other memories that that work their way into, it's always going to be the foundation, I think, of my essay writing.
Sure, right there in the middle.
In both cases, the memoirs are very individual and about personal stories, and there's a thematic and general piece that you're trying to express as well. Can you talk a little about the balance between those two?
Really quickly, I'm going to just repeat the question so that people can hear. A balance between the bigger form of the memoir as a life.
The themes of the memoir.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the individual experiences that you're choosing, both to talk about yourself and also to elucidate those themes.
Bigger themes of the memoir versus the individual stories you've chosen that are going to help illuminate them.
Okay.
That's a big question too.
Okay. I didn't want to write about myself. I thought it was indulgent. I thought it would be annoying for people. I didn't really want to dig in. I didn't want to share anything, right? But I was a kid who grew up craving connection because I moved so much. And once I did allow myself to write personal essay, which I believed I was writing for my people, my Kashmiri people, and I saw that the more specific I could get in a piece, the more people connected with it from all kinds of backgrounds. I knew that I had unlocked something for myself. So I worked through the discomfort of writing about myself, which I still kind of hate. I don't love it, but it allows me the thing that I really want, which is for me to lay down my feelings about something and say, does anyone else feel this way? And for people to read it and pick up and go, oh my God, I didn't know you could feel this way too. And I think I was a lonely kid. I was a very, very lonely child. I talk about that a lot. I didn't have many friends. I'm fine now. I'm okay, I have friends. It all worked out for me. Worked out great. I have friends that I birthed. They're my best friends. I have a husband who's contractually bound. But it's overwhelming. It's been overwhelming, honestly, how many connections I've been able to make through the writing. And so the themes that come out are universal, which I had no idea could happen. I had no idea that I could write the story of my family and have so many people see themselves in it, whether it's about my brother, my parents, my background, my feelings that I felt about school, feelings that I felt about being lonely, and it's just all the themes everything's universal. We're all just sharing this like excruciating experience, and it's so beautiful to kind of give myself over to that and see other people give themselves over to it. I don't know if that answers the question. That's just my experience.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you brought up loneliness too. I mean, because for me, I think a big part of the writing is like about abating loneliness. And I think about the book, I mean, I guess anything that I would write as being less about me and more about a kind of person who I happen to have, like the interior life of a kind of person that I happen to have more access to. And whose, personality, insecurities, shortcomings, etc., I'm willing to explicate because I think it's important and I think it's difficult work to do. But my assumption, which has borne out to be kind of true, is also that people will come up to you and say things. And, oftentimes the things are more interesting that they will not bring up in Q&As or in front of other people that will say like, oh, I had this thing happen to me too. Or I felt this way, or I had this particular kind of thought, because we're supposed to be embarrassed and or ashamed about the things that are most important to the workings of your mind, which is a really strange way to become a person in the world. And for me, that's the most gratifying part of it, is that it doesn't necessarily feel like it's really about me, but it's about like describing a certain kind of person.
I think I heard you say earlier that there's an idea that memoir is solipsistic or something like that, and you disagree with that.
Yeah.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah, and this isn't to say that it can't be. I think all bad writing in general is solipsistic, no matter what the genre is, and that's part of the problem. What I would say is that I don't think it's solipsistic because it's really important to think about the circumstances of your own formation, the things that you take for granted, the things that you do not, the things that you really desire that you might not necessarily say on Instagram because it won't get you more followers, etc. And without that, you can't really have anything significant to say about the state of the world, which I think is what we all kind of want to do. I'm thinking explicitly about like progressives and the circle of people who I affiliate with most often. So a lot of that stuff falls apart because people are unwilling to be honest in any way about what they actually think or feel in particular situations. And for me, my like explicit interest is describing how there are types of people who we seem to be wanting to advocate for, who we would never sit in the same room with. And those are the kinds of, when I say type of person, like that's always top of mind for me.
Let me just repeat it for everybody. Did you work with editors in the progression of the book? Did they allow you or ask you to rearrange things or to develop things?
My editor at Knopf, I sold it on proposal, and I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted the book to be, and she was the one who ultimately figured out the order of the pieces. She was like, I think I know what you need it to be. I hope I'm not overstepping. And she cracked it, and she made it. She definitely helped make it the book that it is.
I think less than editors, it was my agent, because I was basically like, stalking my agent for I don't know how many years or whatever, and trying to connect with him because I knew I wanted this person to be my agent for lots of reasons. And I would send them a piece, get no reply, or I would talk to him later and he'd be like, this is not ready yet, maybe do this, this, and this, or whatever. And then I would send it again. He'd be like, this is still not ready yet, like do this, this, and this, or what have you. And I went back and forth with him for years before he even said, okay, like I will represent this. And in that time, I had met my editor, and all these other things had kind of happened. So it really was a going back and forth with him more than anyone else.
That's a cool, rare relationship too. That's not everybody's experience with editors or with agents. Yeah.
Your life is
How do you know when to conclude your memoir since you're still alive?
Yeah, unfortunately, we have to keep going, you know.
Yeah, I finished this memoir. The memoir ends basically right before I handed it in. And then I sold them a second book, but the second book was going to be a nonfiction book about a subject I will not tell you, because they were like, they basically were a series of emails and calls. We're like, no, can you just keep writing about yourself? And I was like, oh no, okay, I can figure it out if you pay me. So yeah, it just keeps going, I guess. Life just keeps going. So my second book will again be another, but it's like happening now, which is kind of like weird to process.
Maybe my question being.
Yeah, yes. What did you say? It'll be the epigraph.
You can stick around
It'll be
later
like-
to give names and
Yeah.
permissions.
I will.
Yeah.
Life keeps going. You're not wrong. That's a title. It's a new title.
It's I mean, I think that's really interesting. It's funny, that's advice I always give students, which is like when they ask me, how do you get past this thing? I'm like, make the problem one of the foundational points of the book itself. Such that I think that one of the interesting things about nonfiction is that it forces you to create the kind of sentences that make sense but continue to be true, and sometimes they have to do with questions and like ongoingness or something like that. So you get caught up in a problem and you have to turn a phrase and be like, this is the problem that I came across when trying to describe this thing. Someone who does that really well, I think, is Mitchell Jackson in Survival Math, for example. But ultimately, it depends. For like a kind of old school story thing is like, you could be like, a story is something that matters. Matt Johnson says this a lot. Something that matters changes forever, and figuring out what that thing is. I had a lot of beefs with this ending of the book because I didn't want to do like the appended, now I am like at an Ivy League university, like aren't we all happy kind of thing. And for me, the foundation of it was thinking about loneliness and what loneliness meant, and I wanted to figure out a way to encapsulate these years of like 7 to 13 and having a change in, like how comfortable you feel in your own body and relationships to other people, and arguing that is like incredibly significant and underplayed. I think we don't write about friendship obviously as much as we write about partnerships, love, etc. But for me, I'm like, what is the thing that ended up keeping me alive? It's like, because I made friends with people. It's like very simple, and I wanted to turn into something kind of subtle in that way.
Yeah, fantastic. And I'll just say the end of your book also has that really great, it doesn't make everything happy, but there's a moment at the end where you're just like, and I'm not gonna give it away, but like where you're like, oh, but there's progress. There's like, we're going towards something. So it doesn't end, it just ends. I know that sounds weird, but it's true. It's really great. So I highly recommend both. One more question, and then I think we have to wrap it up. Does anybody have one last one to end on? I totally do. Because we have just a few minutes, right? Both of you contend with kind of big world events in your book, but yours happens at the beginning, yours happens at the end. And it kind of, I think it dovetails off the question we just got, which is finding that ending place is hard when the world's still changing. How does using, and again, I won't give away what happens at the end of your book, but it's significant to the plot that's playing out with Joey, with you. How did you choose? Well, I think it's pretty easy to answer, but like, how did you choose what to reveal about it and what to keep back from it, considering they were both well-known events in the world?
I presented the facts as clearly as I could. My community fled basically under cover of night in '89, and that was the inciting incident for everything.
Yeah.
And so that was like really clear. But then there were also other events. I was in Saudi Arabia during the Gulf War, so that was another big one. There was a big family tragedy that also happened. That's also in there. So there were these three kind of big, very things that had shaped my life, I tried to be as clear-eyed and unsentimental as I could about those things, while still saying, I don't use the word trauma in here, I don't use that, there's no diagnoses, there's no nothing. I just tried to be super clear that these are the facts that then echoed throughout our lives in these ways, because there was just a tone that I was trying to avoid, and it was the kind of cerebral, let's like psychoanalyze all of it. It was just like, here is how it affected our emotions from then on, and hopefully, you see yourself in this, even if your plot points were not exactly the same and your family's not exactly the same. I think we all are human, and so it kind of echoes and ripples in the same ways.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in deciding how to convey, like bigger world events, for me it was all about what some of the primary characters' relationships to the event was, or like what their relationship to power was, and it also had to do with being a reader also, and I would read over and over again accounts of the same thing, to such an extent that sometimes you can't even distinguish the voice or who the person is, but there's a repertoire that we established, and a kind of mode of norms that you're supposed to, ways of dealing with things in prose, especially in American prose. And I've thought of one of the ways to kind of upend that is to pay more attention to, I think you said it beautifully, Priyanka, like how people felt about a particular instance, rather than what the television and news station told you to feel about a particular instance. And sometimes that can get really messy, but I think that is the entire point of living with other people, or learning to live with other people.
And I think in both cases it made the event only like subject to the experience, which is really great. Thank you so much. This is a great conversation, and thank you all. It was really great.